Can we crowdsource wisdom? Imagine thousands of people scattered across the globe, each with their own sliver of insight, coming together to answer a single question. Could their collective efforts amount to something we might call wisdom? The internet age has made this scenario an everyday reality. From Reddit threads diagnosing obscure tech glitches to flash mobs of investors on Wall Street turning stock markets upside down, the notion that large groups of ordinary individuals might together produce extraordinary understanding is both inspiring and unsettling. It invites us to explore ancient ideas of a collective mind, going back to Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, and to trace how those ideas manifest in modern phenomena of collective intelligence, tangible collective consciousness in our digital networks. In this long journey, we will delve into psychology, sociology, philosophy, and technology to ask, can we truly crowdsource wisdom? We'll begin by unpacking Jung's vision of a deep psychic connectedness among humans, the early fascination with the hive mind of crowds, the surprising accuracy of group judgments, the wisdom of crowds, and the rise of internet platforms that harness the many sometimes brilliantly, sometimes disastrously. We'll examine how Reddit hive minds, collaborative projects like Wikipedia, decentralized decision-making via blockchain DAOs, and prediction markets each attempt to aggregate our knowledge or decision power along the way. We'll compare these real-world collective systems, our Reddit and Wikipedia, the new amphitheaters where humanity's shared archetypes and ideas play out in real time. Do decentralized, autonomous organizations, or are they just more efficient polling tools? And fundamentally, when people talk about a hive mind or group mind, do they mean a literal new form of consciousness? This journey is both academic and conversational. We'll reference psychological and sociological studies, from ancient Greek philosophy to science fiction, imaginings about collective wisdom and folly. Over the next hour or so, let's dive deep into the idea of shared minds and see what insights surface. Consider this a thoughtful exploration rather than a final verdict. By the end, you may find your perspective enriched and perhaps a bit more skeptical of easy answers about whether wisdom can truly be crowdsourced. Jung's collective unconscious, a shared psychic heritage. Our exploration starts almost a century ago. In the mind of Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung, Jung introduced a provocative idea in the early 20th century. Deep beneath the personal thoughts and feelings of each individual lies a collective unconscious. Unlike our personal unconscious, the reservoir of our individual memories and forgotten experiences, the collective unconscious is shared by all humans. Jung described it as a repository of primordial images and patterns, what he called archetypes, that recur across cultures and eras. Think of archetypes as ancient mental templates. The hero, the great mother, the trickster, the shadow, and so on. These figures and themes appear in myths and art from societies that had no contact with each other, suggesting to Jung that they spring from a common source in the human psyche. It's as if we're all tuned to the same deep frequencies, regardless of our individual upbringing. Jung's collective unconscious. It's not like a radio where you suddenly hear everyone else's thoughts. Rather, it operates underneath awareness. For example, a young child who has never heard the tale of Hercules might nonetheless invent stories of a super-strong savior battling monsters because Jung would argue, or consider how certain symbols, a serpent, a sun, a labyrinth, seem to carry universal meaning or emotional charge. We respond to them not just due to personal association, but because our ancestors responded to them for millennia, baking these responses into our psychic inheritance. Jung wasn't saying that people are telepathically connected, or that we literally share thoughts instead. He was positing a shared structure of the psyche, an analogy. All humans share roughly the same anatomical blueprint: 2 eyes, a heart. But each of us has our own unique body. Similarly, the collective unconscious provides a kind of psychological blueprint, common instinctual patterns and imagery, upon which individual experiences build unique personalities. So, in Jung's view, humanity has a kind of psychic unity at the deepest level, but not a merged group consciousness. We each still have our private mind, yet we draw from a common well of ancient wisdom and ancient fear, desire, etc. Jung's concept straddled the line between science and mysticism. He developed it through his work with patients and his study of myths. But it's not something easily proven or measured. Many in mainstream psychology saw, and still see, the collective unconscious as speculative, a poetic way to talk about cross-cultural similarities, perhaps, but not a literal stored memory bank. Yet the power of Jung's idea can't be denied. It speaks to a romantic notion that humanity, at a fundamental level, is one that across time and space, we are linked by threads of shared story and meaning. This notion has inspired countless artists, writers, and thinkers. One way to visualize the collective unconscious. No single person can read all these books directly, but their influence seeps into our dreams. He was struck that certain images appeared that the individuals could not have personally encountered, yet those images corresponded to obscure myths or religious motifs from other cultures. It was as if the dreamers had, unwittingly, pulled something from a shared cultural repository to Jung. This was evidence that we inherit more than just eye color and blood type. We inherit a psyche with predispositions to think and feel in particular timeless patterns now. Why start with Jung in a discussion of crowdsourcing wisdom? At first glance, Jung's collective unconscious seems almost the opposite of crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing, whether of information, labor, or wisdom, is a very conscious. People actively contribute bits of knowledge or decision-making, often via technology, to produce an aggregate result. Jung's collective unconscious. It's more like an implicit collective memory that we're usually unaware of, however. The link lies in the idea of a collective mind or spirit. Jung gave one answer, mystical and inward, to how humanity might share wisdom. Modern technology gives another, pragmatic and outward, via networks and data. Both raise the question, is there a higher collective order emerging from individual contributions? Jung might say it has always been there. In our myths and dreams, technologists might say we are building it now, in our silicon chips and fiber optics. Interestingly, the internet has even been described by some Jungians as a kind of externalized collective unconscious, brought to light what was once hidden in private minds. The hopes, fears, archetypal obsessions of millions are laid bare in Google search trends, viral memes, popular movies, and online discussion. The internet is the most tangible embodiment of Jung's collective unconscious that humanity has ever known. Our personal experiences converge online into a big soup of information and stories. Would he see the shadow archetype playing out in cancel culture mobs, the hero archetype in our celebrity worship or Marvel movies? It's a fascinating lens. The content of the internet, all those billions of messages and images, might be revealing the unconscious archetypes in real time, like a collective dream unfolding on screen. Of course, not everyone will buy that interpretation. We could just as well say the internet is a reflection of conscious interest. And yet, when millions of people unknowingly share the same meme format to express frustration, think of the endless distracted boyfriend or expanding brain meme variation. Isn't there an uncanny sense of unity somehow? Without central coordination, large groups seize on the same symbols to capture an emotion or idea. Jung would smile at this. It's exactly how archetypes operate, popping up independently in many places. The difference is that now we can watch this happen in a matter of days on social media, rather than over centuries of oral tradition. So Jung's legacy to our question is a provocative one. If there is any wisdom of the crowd, perhaps it's not something new with the internet, but something very old in the human psyche, that's simply taking new form. Just because something is collectively shared doesn't mean it's wise in the moral or practical sense. Archetypes include the dark and chaotic as much as the wise old say. The collective unconscious might unite us, but it can unite us in irrational fears or violent impulses, which leads us to the next part of our journey, examining how crowds behave and whether groups amplify intelligence or undermine it. The crowd, wisdom or madness, a historical perspective long before the internet, long even before Jung thinkers were wrestling with the nature of crowds and collective behavior. Are groups of people together smarter than individuals, or do they descend into base instincts? History provided evidence for both views. On one hand, we have the adage, two heads are better than one. and democratic ideals, that the many can govern themselves more wisely than a single tyrant. On the other hand, we speak of mob mentality and point to moments when crowds seem to lose all reason, from witch hunts in the 19th century as mass society and democracy spread. This question took center stage. A French scholar named Gustave Le Bon wrote a famous work in 1895 called The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. Le Bon's view was rather pessimistic about collective intelligence. He argued that when individuals form a psychological crowd, something almost alchemical happens. The individuals surrender their rational minds and moral compass to the group soul. They share the same mental unity, he wrote, describing how diverse people in a crowd suddenly think and feel as one. According to Le Bon, a crowd becomes like a single organism, but not a very intelligent or ethical one. In his words, emotion dominates, contagion spreads, and the crowd can be impulsive, credulous, and extreme. Individuals in a crowd may do things they'd never contemplate alone because they are swept up in the collective mind, which Le Bon likened to a sort of hypnotic trance. He observed, for example, how ordinary citizens during the French Revolution became capable of gruesome violence when fused into mob fervor, something he thought the group soul enabled by dulling individual responsibility and intellect. Le Bon's ideas. Leaders from political revolutionaries to propagandists read his work on how crowds operated, put forth a frankly frightening picture of collective consciousness, a primitive, unconscious beast lurking in society that could be awakened when people gathered in large numbers. Le Bon saw the collective mind of a crowd as a source of primitive urges, something that could destroy civilization's progress. Mass protests, worker movements, the rise of popular media, and his skepticism of the crowd was one reaction. Not all thinkers agreed with this dim view. An opposing perspective, surprisingly, comes from earlier history. Aristotle, over 20 years ago, anticipated a more positive take on group decision-making in his work Politic, of whom each individual is but an ordinary person. When they meet together, may very likely be better than the few good, basically suggesting that a diverse group could outperform a select elite. He used a lovely metaphor. A potluck dinner, a feast where many guests contribute dishes, might be better than a banquet provided by one cook. Why? Because each person may have a bit of knowledge or virtue to contribute to the whole. When pulled together, the group becomes in a manner one man who has many feet and hands, and senses a stronger, more resourceful being. Aristotle essentially argued that collective judgment under the right conditions. This idea lay mostly dormant for ages, but it's a clear seed of the modern notion of the wisdom of crowds. Aristotle did include caveat. The crowd needs to deliberate, exchange ideas, and not be a mob swayed by passion alone. In other words, structure matters. The crowd he imagined wasn't a horde in the streets. It was more like an assembly of citizens. That distinction is critical and echoes through modern research. When and how a crowd is aggregated determines whether it skews toward wisdom or madness. So by the early 20th century, we had these contrasting visions: Jung's collective unconscious deep, shared imagery, and perhaps wisdom, but subconscious. Le Bon's crowd mind, a collective soul that is emotional and potentially irrational. And Aristotle's many as one, a collective judgment that could surpass individual thinking if properly harnessed. Fast forward to the present, and the question remains when we crowdsource answers or decisions. Does connecting many minds lead to cumulative insight? Or do we risk unleashing the primitive herd impulses? Our modern world, especially with the internet, has provided a massive testing ground for these theories. The wisdom of crowds, when the many outperform the few. The phrase wisdom of crowds entered the popular lexicon thanks to journalist James Surowiecki. Perhaps the most famous anecdote is from 1907, when British scientist Francis Galton stumbled upon a contest at a country fair. Villagers were guessing the weight of an ox to win a prize. After the contest, Galton, ever the curious statistician, took all 787 guesses and calculated their average remarkably. The crowd's average guess was 1197 pounds, off by only 1 pound. This was astounding. No single butcher or farmer at the fair got it exactly right, but somehow the aggregate of nearly 800 imperfect guesses. Who actually expected the crowd to be way off? he thought only experts could guess well. It was an empirical hint that under the right circumstances. Why would that be the key insight? Is that different people's errors can cancel out. One person guesses too high, another too low, if you have enough independent guesses. The crowd in Galton's case had something going for it. Each person guessed independently, and they had diverse information. Some were farmers with knowledge of livestock, some were lay people guessing by eye, etc. Additionally, there was a motivation for each to guess sincerely, a small entry fee and prize. Diversity of opinion, independence, and a mechanism to aggregate are now recognized as crucial for crowds to be wise. Surowiecki's book, The Wisdom of Crowds, elaborated on many such examples. Crowds can predict election outcomes. Even the location of a lost submarine, as happened when the US Navy, in 1968, asked a bunch of experts to independently guess where a missing sub might be at. The average of their guesses was very close to the actual location. The principle is basically what Aristotle intuited and Galton demonstrated. No one of us knows everything, but each of us knows something. And if we combine our knowledge in the right way, the result can be greater than the sum of its parts. One real-world instantiation of this idea is the prediction market. These are like stock markets, where the commodity is information about future events. If X is seen as likely to win, the price per share will be high, approaching $1 if using a $0–1 scale for probability. If unlikely, the price will be low. The market price essentially becomes the crowd's collective probability estimate, and indeed, prediction markets have often been eerily accurate. The Iowa Electronic Markets, IM, a famous academic project, allowed trading on us election outcomes in the 5 presidential elections from 1988 to 2020. The IM's prices in the week before the election predicted the vote shares 5 percentage points, beating the average polls, which had about 2% error. That's a small but significant edge to the crowd. Why do markets work well? Partly because they give people incentive to be truthful. You make money if you're right. Someone very confident in their info will buy more shares, put more money on it, moving the price. Self-weighting poll, where those with better insight or data end up having more sway via betting more. It's not just elections. Companies like Google and Ford have used internal prediction markets to forecast things like product completion dates or sales figures. In essence, these markets crowdsource foresight. They lean on that idea that distributed knowledge in an organization or society can be aggregated into a single best guess. When you see a prediction market price, you're seeing the collective intelligence at work, or at least collective information process. Another demonstration comes from the domain of forecasting tournaments, a US government project. A decade ago, the ARPA-funded Good Judgment Project, led by Philip Tetlock, recruited ordinary folks to make thousands of predictions. Over time, they identified superforecasters, individuals who were exceptionally good. But interestingly, when these forecasters were put in teams or their estimates were averaged, their accuracy increased further again. Even the best forecaster has blind spots, but if you combine several independent thinkers, the blind spots overlap. Less so? Absolutely not, and this is where the nuance comes in. Independence is crucial. If those 787 villagers at the fair had been allowed to discuss before writing their guesses, or if they could see each other's answers, maybe a few loud voices would have convinced everyone the ox was surely 1,500 pounds. If people start imitating each other or being swayed, the error does not cancel out and can even compound. This is exactly what happens in many real-world situations that produce crowd folly rumors, spreading everyone believes X, because everyone else seems to. Stock bubbles, people buy because others are buying, and so on. Later we'll discuss how the internet can amplify these kinds of herd behaviors. In the fair example, not everyone was a livestock expert, and that was a good thing. If you had only farmers guessing, they might all share a common bias. Including some non-experts and different perspectives can actually improve the crowd's performance diversity. There's a mathematical aspect to this, often called the diversity trumps ability theorem. In certain contexts, meaning a diverse group of solvers can outperform a homogeneous group of the best individual solvers. Because the diverse group explores more possibilities and avoids correlated mistakes, we start to see that crowdsourcing wisdom isn't magic. It's engineering the conditions for group success. If you get it right, the results can be spectacular, like Wikipedia, which we'll soon talk about being as accurate as traditional encyclopedias in many areas. If you get it wrong, you get mobs, echo chambers, groupthink, and collective delusion. Informational versus normative influence. Sometimes in groups, people influence each other because they truly exchange information. Informational. I hadn't thought of that. Good point. I'll update my opinion. Other times, people just conform to fit in, or because they assume others must know better. Normative, everyone else. The wisdom of crowds needs the former, without too much of the latter. Modern platforms. For example, when polling a large audience, you might ask people to vote privately rather than show a running tally to preserve independence, or you ensure anonymity to reduce peer pressure. A classic example of a crowd going wrong was the tragedy of the Challenger space shuttle decision. In retrospect, engineers had private doubts, but in group discussions at NASA, those concerns got watered down and the group fell into a false consensus. A case of groupthink where the desire for harmony or avoiding conflict led to suppressing dissenting information. Essentially, groupthink was studied by Irving Janis, who noted it in political fiascos like the Bay of Pigs invasion, when groups become too insular, too hierarchical, or too eager to agree. On the flip side, groups can be structured to avoid these pitfalls. Modern collective intelligence research shows. A 2010 study found evidence that groups have a measurable collective intelligence factor, call it C, analogous to individual IQ, which predicts their performance on a variety of tasks. A group C factor was not strongly related to the average or highest individual IQ in the group. Instead, it correlated with how well the group members cooperated, specifically how sensitive they were to each other's cues, and the proportion of women in the group. The female connection seemed to be because on average in that sample, women scored higher on social sensitivity, reading others' emotion, and that trait in any person, man or woman, contributed to group effectiveness. In other words, a smart group is not just a bunch of smart people. It's a group that communicates openly, listens to each other, and has empathy. Social intelligence, not just raw IQ, makes the collective intelligence. This finding reinforces that wisdom in crowds comes from the process of combining minds effectively. A well-facilitated brainstorming session or diverse team, because they'll build on each other's partial ideas and catch each other's mistakes. So yes, crowds can be wise in guessing the weight of an ox, predicting elections, editing Wikipedia, solving puzzles. A well-constituted group often outperforms individuals or even experts, but crowds can also be disastrously wrong if they become an echo chamber or succumb to emotional contagion. The line between collective wisdom and collective folly is thin and must be managed with care. With this general understanding, let's dive into specific modern manifestations of collective intelligence. We'll look at Reddit's so-called hive mind, the grand experiment of Wikipedia, the new wave of decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, on the blockchain, and the burgeoning world of prediction markets. Each provides a different angle on our core question, and each can be measured against Jung's dreamy ideal of a collective psyche or against Le Bon's nightmare of the mob. Reddit and the hive mind. The crowd on social media. If you've spent any time on the internet, especially in forums or social media, you've likely encountered the idea of the hive mind. On Reddit, one of the largest online communities, users often jokingly or not so jokingly refer to the Reddit hive mind. This term captures the sense that Reddit, as a collective, tends to have shared opinions, in-jokes, and even coordinated behaviors, almost like a single organism with millions of cells. It's a fascinating example of emergent collective intelligence and sometimes collective stupidity in the wild. Without any formal hierarchy or structure beyond the platform's design, Reddit is organized into countless subreddits, forums on every topic. The voting mechanism is a simple way to aggregate the crowd's preference on what content is valuable or interesting, in theory, surfacing the best stuff to the top. It is, essentially, crowdsourced filtering of information. Instead of an editor deciding what news or posts should be front and center, the users collectively decide by voting in practice. Reddit's front page across different subreddits often does highlight compelling content that no single curator could have assembled, because it's drawn from the diverse tastes and knowledge of millions of users. It can surface breaking news faster than traditional media because someone, somewhere. It also democratizes content creation theoretically. If you write something brilliant or funny, even as a nobody, the crowd can elevate your post to wide visibility. Researchers have looked at Reddit as an example of whether distributed moderation leads to a hive mind or a true collective intelligence. Approach 1 study, meaning a majority of users see only what has already been voted to the top. Minority opinions or niche content can be marginalized, not completely silenced, but certainly less visible. This suggests a power law dynamic. Popular things get more popular simply because they're seen. Rich get richer effect. So while many voices contribute, the emergent voice of Reddit can sometimes be monolithic on a given issue. If you have ever seen the comment section of a Reddit post, you might notice the top comments, sorted by votes, themselves joke that the top comment is effectively the opinion of Reddit as a whole. And it's common to see replies like, the hive mind has decreed this, the correct answer. There have been both heroic and problematic instances of Reddit's collective action. On the heroic side, Reddit users have come together to do things like fundraise for charity, solve complex puzzles. For example, a few years back, Redditors famously collaborated to decipher an ARG alternate reality game called Cicada 3301. Subreddits like Archetypes, essentially a many-to-one advice column. This is crowd wisdom in a straightforward sense. Someone asks, why do we have seasons, and multiple science enthusiasts chime in with pieces of the explanation, the best of which get upvoted to the top, yielding a collectively vetted answer. However, Reddit's hive mind has also shown a dangerous side. A notorious example was the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing manhunt. In the aftermath of the bombing, Reddit users in a subreddit called /Find Boston Bombers effectively spreading a false accusation that spilled into social media at large and caused a great deal of harm. This was an internet mob misidentifying a suspect collective intelligence. The crowd, lacking the investigative rigor of professionals, amplified a mistake. It was a striking case of how an online hive mind can go astray. Reddit later publicly apologized for this failure. Another much discussed saga is Wall Street Bets, a Reddit community of amateur stock traders that in 2021 collectively poured into meme stocks like GameStop and AMC. This swarm of small investors, communicating on Reddit and hyping each other up, managed to dramatically inflate the stock prices and inflict massive losses on some Wall Street hedge funds that had bet against those companies. It was described as a hive mind of average people on Reddit, taking on the financial elite. Think housecuke.com. Indeed, in early 2021, our Wall Street Bets users banded together to buy GameStop stock en masse, sending it soaring and wreaking havoc on Wall Street firms that had shorted the stock. Their collective action forced major investors to reconsider what was happening. It was a bit of crowd chaos injected into an otherwise controlled financial system. Some hailed this as the democratization of finance, the crowd exercising power, while others saw it as a dangerous mob bubble destined to hurt those same small investors when reality caught up. In either case, it showed that an internet-coordinated crowd could have very real-world impact, almost like a digital flash mob with economic consequences. Like the Borg in Star Trek, where all drones share one mind, Reddit's hive mind isn't that literal, of course. It's more of a metaphor for consensus culture on Reddit. As in other social media, people often chase karma points upvote. This is where the normative influence we discussed kicks in. Even if a dissenting view might be valuable, it might get downvoted into oblivion because it doesn't fit the prevalent narrative or joke format. So, the Reddit hive mind can create echo chambers, a collective that believes it's wise, but maybe it's just self-reinforcing a bias. Yet, one could argue that across its many sub-communities, Reddit as a whole encapsulates a vast range of perspectives like a giant global forum. It has hive minds plural, often disagreeing with each other. The R-politics hive mind leans one way, the R-conservative hive mind another. Perhaps true wisdom would emerge if one could somehow integrate across all these silos. But that rarely happens on the platform itself. due to how people self-select communities. Reddit exemplifies collective intelligence. Every upvote, every comment contributes to a sorting of ideas. It can rapidly answer questions. How do I fix this computer error? We'll often get a correct, crowdsourced answer if the question hits enough eyeballs. In that sense, for certain queries, it's like a crowdsourced Q&A, a system that can be very effective in fact. The whole concept of crowdsourced Q&A, seen in sites like Stack Exchange for programming questions, has proven extremely useful for tapping into the crowd's knowledge. If you ask a sufficiently interesting or common question in the right community, odds are someone out there knows the answer or can figure it out, and others will validate it. That's collective wisdom in action. On the other hand, Reddit also shows how collective emotions can be amplified. Online outrage can spread like wildfire. So can joy or fascination with a meme when millions participate in an inside joke like the April Fools, such as creating a massive pixel art canvas together. It feels as if the internet community has a life of its own, playful and creative. These moments can be quite heartwarming, disparate strangers cooperating spontaneously for fun. Some have likened these events to proof of a kind of virtual collective consciousness, where social media lets large groups act in synchrony during the Arab Spring protests. For instance, commentators noted that tools like Facebook and Twitter enabled leaderless masses to coordinate and share a collective sentiment for freedom against regimes in a new way. Scholars termed this a virtual collective consciousness, when a large group of people think and act with one mind and share collective emotions. Reddit's community experiments and Wall Street Bet's stock surges are very different examples. The answer is both. It depends on which subreddit, what question, and how the community norms function. When well moderated and knowledge-driven, like niche subs where experts hang out, Reddit can produce extremely high-quality collective answers. When driven by hype or tribalism, it can produce groupthink and errors. The hive mind is sometimes self-deprecatingly referenced by Redditors because they know there's a tendency for the top-voted opinion to become a shared dogma. It's a reminder that simply pooling opinions isn't enough. You also need critical thinking and diversity to keep the collective honest in sum. Reddit gives us a microcosm of the collective mind. Dynamic, powerful, occasionally brilliant, occasionally dangerous. Upvotes alone create a winner-takes-all effect, but introducing thoughtful discussion and dissent can elevate it. As we navigate further, keep Reddit's lessons in mind. They'll resonate when we consider other crowdsourced endeavors. Wikipedia, the world's collective brain or echo chamber. No discussion of collective intelligence is complete without Wikipedia, arguably the most successful crowdsourcing project in history. Think about it, an encyclopedia written by volunteers, with no central authority assigning tasks. By traditional logic, that sounds like a recipe for an unreliable mess, and yet, Wikipedia has defied expectation. It has over 6 million articles in English, and millions more across other languages, covering an astonishing breadth of topics. How did an anarchic crowd of internet users manage to create something that, in many respects, rivals or even surpasses expert-produced encyclopedias? The secret lies in a robust set of community. Wikipedia operates on principles like neutral point of view. Articles shouldn't take sides, not editors' personal theories, thousands of dedicated editors. There's also a structure of volunteer admins with special powers to lock pages or ban persistently disruptive users. In essence, Wikipedia has evolved a hive mind with immune systems. The body of knowledge is the collective output, but there are antibodies, vigilant editors. Studies have found that Wikipedia's accuracy on many topics is surprisingly high. A famous Nature study in 25 compared a set of science articles on Wikipedia and Encyclopedia Britannica and found Britannica disputed the methodology. But the broad takeaway was that Wikipedia wasn't ridiculously error-ridden, as skeptics assumed since 25. Wikipedia has grown enormously and improved its quality control. By 2019, an analysis noted that Wikipedia's number of errors is on par with professional sources, even in specialized topics such as biology or medicine, in areas like pharmacology or geography. Various studies have shown Wikipedia to be quite reliable, though often less readable than a polished textbook. One academic article argued it's high time for academia to acknowledge Wikipedia's quality and even engage with it positively. After all, it's the first place many students go. Why not help make it better? What makes Wikipedia work as a crowdsourced wisdom repository? First, diversity and scale. It has contributors from all over the world, contributing knowledge that no single publisher could have marshaled. You'll find a meticulously referenced article on a small-town railway station. This long tail of knowledge is a huge strength. Second, the structure and norms we mentioned. It's not a free-for-all where every opinion stays. Consensus building among editors is key. If someone adds a biased paragraph, another will challenge it and cite a source. Edit wars do happen, especially on politically or emotionally charged topics, but even those tend to settle over time, or the article gets locked until tempers cool. Wikipedia also leverages some subtle quality control mechanisms. For example, articles can have tags at the top warning readers. This both alerts readers to be cautious and motivates editors to fix the issue, because it's a bit of a badge of shame to have those tags on an article one cares about. There are also bots that automatically revert obvious vandalism, like blanking a page or adding slurs. And a recent feature displays an icon if an edit is from a very new account or IP address. In short, the community has built tools to keep the collective effort on track from a Jungian perspective. One might poetically say that Wikipedia, all the archetypes, histories, biographies of heroes and villains, the accumulated scientific knowledge. But is there wisdom in it, or just information? Arguably, Wikipedia's strength is factual knowledge and coverage of published viewpoints. It doesn't really do synthesis or deep wisdom. Original thought isn't allowed. It won't tell you what policy is best or give philosophically novel insight. So in terms of wisdom, which implies judgment and insight, Wikipedia might be limited. It's more a collective intellect than a collective wisdom keeper. However, one could say having easy access to humanity's knowledge base is a prerequisite for wisdom. You can't be wise. In that sense, Wikipedia is an enabler of wisdom in individuals. We all draw from it, if not a source of wisdom itself. One concern sometimes raised: does Wikipedia reflect a collective bias after all? If most editors on a topic lean a certain way, that might tilt the article despite neutrality policy. There have been studies on political bias in Wikipedia. For example, researchers examined articles on US politics and found that, over time, on highly controversial subjects, multiple viewpoints get included and hashed out on talk pages. Wikipedia's ideal of neutrality doesn't mean view from no, but rather representing all significant viewpoints in proportion to their prominence in reliable sources. It's imperfect, but the transparent history, one can see every change made, and the discussions keeps an ongoing check if an article is captured by a click with an agenda. Other editors, or eventually Wikipedia's arbitration committees, can step in to mediate. It's like a self-governing little democracy of knowledge in many cases. Through dialectic, someone adds a claim, another demands a citation, a third finds a source. The article slowly approximates a well-rounded summary. It's messy but effective. To illustrate how far collective editing can go, take the COVID-19 pandemic page. At the height of the pandemic, it was being edited hundreds of times a day by people across the world, incorporating the latest statistics. Faster than any traditional publication could update readers, could literally see humanity's understanding of a novel virus. Of course, there were edit conflicts and some misinformation attempts quickly removed, but overall, it became a comprehensive and reasonably accurate timeline. Thanks to volunteers dedicated to sourcing everything properly, that is a stunning example of crowdsourcing timely wisdom, or at least knowledge on a global scale. Wikipedia also illustrates a point about crowd motivation. Why do people contribute for free? Some see it as altruism, sharing knowledge for the common good. Others enjoy the craft and collaboration. Some like the reputation within the community. Whatever the mix, it shows that crowds can self-organize, given the right incentives, even intrinsic ones, to create something enduring. It's not all short-term mobs. There are online crowds that behave more like dedicated gardeners, cultivating a public knowledge garden. In summary, Wikipedia stands. It's arguably one of humanity's crowning achievements. It required evolving rules and values to guide the crowd. It diverges from Jung's collective unconscious concept. in that it's very conscious and deliberate. People explicitly communicating, editing, reasoning together, it's less mysterious. Yet, one could poetically say Wikipedia is the conscious version of Jung's idea. What was implicit in disparate cultural memories is now made explicit and accessible. For our question, can we crowdsource wisdom? Wikipedia gives a partial answer. We can crowdsource knowledge, which is a foundation of wisdom, but wisdom also involves judgment about actions and value. Wikipedia doesn't decide what we should do with the knowledge, it just provides the facts and some interpretation of facts. To see crowdsourcing applied to decisions and governance, where wisdom in the sense of good judgment is really tested, we should look at new experiments like DAOs, decentralized decision-making. Blockchain DAOs as collective brains in recent years. Decentralized autonomous organization. The jargon is fancy. DAOs are essentially crowdsourced organizations or governance structures instead of a CEO or a government official calling the shots. Imagine a company where all shareholders vote on every major decision, or a club where funds are spent only if a quorum agrees, and all of this enforced by code, smart contracts on a blockchain so that it's transparent and tamper-proof. That's a DAO in a nutshell, a group of people pooling resources and making decisions democratically and autonomously without a centralized authority. One of the earliest and most famous DAOs was literally called the DAO. The DAO famously got hacked due to a code vulnerability and lost a lot of money, causing a big scandal and a fork in the Ethereum blockchain. That early stumble might have made DAOs look dubious. Since then, DAOs have proliferated in various forms. There are DAOs for managing decentralized finance protocols, DAOs that act like collector clubs buying NFTs or rare items collectively, and even a DAO that attempted to buy an original copy of the US Constitution at auction. That one Constitution DAO in late 2021 is a fascinating case, a spontaneous online collective of over 17,000 people pooled together more than $40 million. Their mission was to bid on a first edition copy of the Constitution being auctioned by Sotheby's contributors, receive tokens, which would have been their voting power in deciding what to do with the Constitution if they won H. Loan it to a museum. In a dramatic auction, Constitution DAO ultimately lost a billionaire outbid, but the fact that a ragtag internet group could seriously contend in such a realm was eye-opening. They made history, as the organizers put it. More importantly, they demonstrated how quickly a collective can mobilize significant capital and people behind a shared goal using decentralized tools. In effect, strangers crowdsourced, not also a governance plan. Had they succeeded, thousands would have had to collectively decide the document's fate. It was crowdsourcing applied to ownership and decision rights. DAOs strive for consensus-driven governance. Typically, if a proposal gets majority support and meets any quorum rules, it removes the need to trust a person to carry out the group's will. The code does it. In theory, this ensures the collective wisdom shapes the outcome without intermediaries. A description from a blockchain site puts it. This decentralized decision-making ensures that the collective wisdom and diverse perspectives of the community shape the direction and operations of the organization. In other words, they want to channel the wisdom of the crowd, the token-holding community for governance. Do DAOs work? It's still early, and they're somewhat experimental. Some are functioning well in managing large treasuries, for instance. However, challenges exist. Voter apathy. Often only a small fraction of members vote on proposals. Whale influence. They can sway votes, like large shareholders in a company, and the difficulty of making complex decisions via simple vote. There's also the risk of groupthink or short-termism if token holders. Nonetheless, some DAOs have shown impressive collective coordination. For example, MakerDAO, which manages a decentralized stablecoin system, had to respond to big market crashes. It's like a company responding to a crisis, but instead of a CEO making the call, thousands of token voters did it work. One interesting notion: DAOs formalize something like a collective brain for organization. The members are the neurons, proposals are signals. Is it wiser than a CEO? Not always, but it might be more resilient, or at least more aligned with the group's interests. Advocates say DAOs reduce the principal agent problem, e.g., A CEO might run a company for personal bonuses. It's more democratic, if nothing else. Another angle. DAOs also crowdsource talent. Some DAOs are like online co-ops, where contributors can join and do work writing code and get rewarded by the DAO in these cases. The DAO is a platform for crowdsourcing, not just decisions, but labor and ideas. For example, there are grant DAOs that invite anyone to propose a project, which token holders then vote to fund. It's a bit like crowdsourcing R&D strategy. The promise is that decentralized wisdom avoids single points of failure. There's a famous saying in crypto, wisdom of crowds, genius of few, as a rationale for decentralization. But is that always true? We've seen from earlier discussion that crowds can be wise under certain conditions. If the token holder base is diverse, informed, and voting independently, then yes, then it's not much better than centralized leadership, and maybe worse if the crowd just rubber stamps bad ideas. Transparency is a big pro. For DAOs, every decision and transaction is public on the blockchain, which ideally means accountability. Contrast that with a corporation where decisions are made behind closed doors. Shareholders might not know what's happening. In a DAO, you can't hide decisions. They're literally coded in. That transparency could lead to more trust in the outcome, which is important for collective buy-in. One might wonder, do DAOs tie back to Jung's collective unconscious? The technology is new, but the desire for a leaderless or collectively led structure is old. Interestingly, blockchain enthusiasts often use terms like decentralized wisdom and speak almost spiritually about removing the need for centralized trust banks. It's almost an ideological movement, echoing archetypal themes of freedom, community, and perhaps the archetype of the common good being decided by the common folk, a cautionary tale. If the collective is ignorant or manipulated, DAOs could crowdsource bad decisions swiftly in traditional orgs. A strong leader might sometimes ignore a panicked crowd and make a wise long-term call. Think of a CEO not yielding to a mob of short-term focused investors. In a pure DAO, the crowd's whim is law. So one has to hope the crowd is well-informed and principled. There's ongoing research and experimentation to improve DAO governance, things like quadratic voting to weight votes in a way that benefits smaller stakeholders. Reputation systems votes weighted by proven expertise or contribution, not just money, and prediction market-like forecasting of a proposal's outcomes before finalizing decisions. Nevertheless, DAOs represent a bold attempt to crowdsource wisdom in governance and finance. They are as much social experiments. If they succeed broadly, one could envision future companies or even communities. It's a bit utopian, but some small-scale instances like co-ops and open-source projects already function similarly, just without the fancy blockchain layer. In summary, DAOs carry forward the torch of collective intelligence into the realm of decision-making and resource allocation. They explicitly bank on the idea that crowds, given equal access and stake, can manage their affairs wisely. It's too soon to declare victory. But they offer a tantalizing glimpse at how crowdsourcing might go beyond wisdom to actual collective autonomy, groups acting as self-governing entities. It's as if the hive mind gets a bank account and a constitution of its own. Now, we've looked at crowds in online discussion Reddit, crowds in knowledge compilation Wikipedia, and crowds in governance, crowds in prediction and problem solving, which we touched on earlier with prediction markets, but is worth exploring a bit more because it directly asks, can a crowd outthink the smartest expert on future uncertainties? Collective crystal balls. Earlier, we discussed how groups can average guesses to predict things like election results better than many individual poll respondents. Prediction markets are a prime example of harnessing collective intelligence. It's worth delving a little deeper into why they're considered powerful and what their limitations are, as this is a very clear case of crowdsourcing wisdom in terms of anticipating the future. A prediction market effectively says, we trust the crowd's aggregated betting more than any one forecast. For instance, on a prediction market, if 70% of participants weighted by money think a particular candidate will win, the market price will reflect about a 70% chance. The advantage of markets is that they continuously update and integrate new information, if news breaks that favors the candidate. It's a real-time crowd meter of expectation. The track record of prediction markets has been quite good in some domains, as mentioned. But one interesting anecdote, in the 28 US election, prediction markets were predicting an Obama win well before some pundits were willing to. These markets often beat traditional polling, in part because they incorporate not just polls, economic trends signaled by traders. They also allow people to put money where their mouth is, which filters out some noise. Casual guessers won't bet money, but those who feel strongly, perhaps because they know something or have done their homework. There are also crowd forecasting tournaments like the Good Judgment Project, where individuals submit probability estimates for questions and get scored on accuracy. Top performers emerged the superforecasters. They would share information, debate, and refine each other's forecasts again. It's that principle of multiple perspectives and error correction. One person might catch a factor another missed. They also tended to be people who avoid dogmatism. They change their mind when evidence changes a key ingredient of good collective intelligence. Crowds have been used to solve problems traditionally reserved for experts. A famous example, the Netflix prize. Netflix offered $1 million in 26 to anyone who could significantly improve their movie recommendation algorithm, rather than rely just on in-house engineers. Thousands of teams participated, and in 29, a crowdsourced team did beat Netflix's own algorithm by over 10%. Winning the prize, the twist. The winning solution was actually a blend ensemble of several teams' approaches, a very literal demonstration of wisdom of crowd algorithms. Another domain, crowdsourced science. Projects like Foldit turned protein, folding a complex biochemistry problem into a game for citizen scientists, unexpectedly. Gamers sometimes found solutions to protein structures that eluded AI or experts. There was a case where Foldit players solved the structure of an AIDS-related enzyme that had stumped scientists for years. The crowd, given the right tools and incentives, gamified puzzle environment, explored more creative folds than the specialists had this. But it means a large enough pool of heads trying in parallel can sometimes stumble onto the answer. We can also mention open source software as collective intelligence in action. Linux. It's a prime example of crowdsourcing a very complex product and operating system that rivals those produced by corporate teams. The Linus's law in open source. Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, meaning if you have a large community, someone will find the problem and often someone will fix it. This again highlights diversity and scale. The more minds on a problem, the greater chance one of them has the key insight or the time to solve it, as long as they can coordinate. Now, it's not all rosy. Crowds can also collectively miss something if they have a shared blind spot or if there is a systematic bias. Prediction markets, for example, could fail if the participants are all drawing on the same flawed assumptions. For instance, if a certain outcome is very rare or unprecedented, people might collectively underestimate it, like perhaps the risk of a pandemic in 2019. Hardly anyone predicted the 2020 pandemic timing, though interestingly some crowds did raise alarm signals also. Crowds are not very good at tasks. You wouldn't crowdsource writing a novel word by word, it would be incoherent. Though you might crowdsource ideas for the plot, there's a reason. Some creative and leadership tasks. Sometimes an inspired individual or a tight-knit group can innovate in ways a big crowd couldn't coordinate to do. Crowds excel at evaluation, judging many ideas and picking good ones, and exploration, trying many approaches to find hit. But for integration into a singular, elegant whole, you often need some hierarchy, or at least a smaller team to synthesize. Wikipedia sort of gets around this by having a stable article format and continuous improvement process. It's worth touching on the concept of collective consciousness versus collective intelligence here. Prediction markets and crowds solving puzzles show intelligence, the ability to find correct answers or effective solutions. But do they show consciousness? Not in the subjective, self-aware sense. No one thinks the crowd as a whole is sentient or experiencing qualia. The crowd doesn't have a single brain that feels it. It's an emergent system for information processing. When people say collective consciousness, like a shared understanding or shared focus, for example, the whole country was of one mind after that tragedy meaning everyone was emotionally in sync, or, in a more mystical sense. In our context, we've been focusing on wisdom, which doesn't require that the group is self-aware, only that it produces intelligent outcomes. However, it's fun to note some research that edges a little into that mind-meld territory. Neuroscience, essentially, via communication, their neural patterns align to some extent, especially in areas related to attention and social cognition after a group discussion where consensus is reached. Participants show higher similarity in brain activity patterns while re-watching the stimulus that they discuss. It's as if getting on the same page mentally causes your brains to operate more in unison now. This doesn't mean a group is one consciousness, but it's a lovely scientific illustration that our brains literally tune to each other when we form a shared understanding. The group, for a moment, becomes a bit more like a single system. Some have poetically said this is the bridge between individual and collective mind. Communication synchronizes us biologically to a degree at an extreme. Experiments like Brainet have connected brains via computers using each magnetic stimulation to write signals such that three people together could play a Tetris-like game using direct brain-to-brain communication of yes-no intention. This is extremely rudimentary, but it hints at a future where technology could physically link minds. Brains plugged into a network forming a meta-brain that's science fiction for now, but not entirely far-fetched in concept. For the time being, though, our collective endeavors operate through language and tech platforms. Now, stepping back from all these examples and analyses, we should address directly, is collective consciousness real or metaphorical? We've seen multiple angles. Jung's deep, psychological, collective, unconscious, and purposeful systems to tap collective intelligence, very real in outcome, but not implying a spooky group soul, just effective coordination. Is the collective consciousness real or just a metaphor? After surveying everything from ancient philosophy to Reddit, Wikipedia, DAOs, and beyond, we come to perhaps the most profound layer of the question. When we talk about a hive mind or collective consciousness, how literally do we mean it? Is there actually a new entity, a group mind that has thoughts and intentions of its own? Or are we always just speaking figuratively about many individuals aligned? The answer may depend on one's perspective, metaphor, view. Most scientists and rationalists would say that what appears to be a collective mind is really just coordinated individuals following certain rules or signals. Reddit's hive mind can't think outside of the Redditor's contribution. In this view, saying the crowd decided X is similar to saying the market decided this stock's price. It's a way to describe aggregate outcome without implying the crowd is an agent with its own consciousness. We use anthropomorphic language. The crowd thinks, but we don't literally mean the crowd has a single brain. Literal view. There are more mystical or theoretical takes that flirt with the idea that a collective could become an actual supermind. For example, in sociology, Emile Durkheim talked about the collective conscience of society, the shared norms and values that make social life possible. He didn't mean a ghostly brain hovering above, but he did treat the collective as a level of reality that influences individuals as social fact. Some modern theorists, like those in AI, the global brain community, speculate that the internet is networking us so intimately that we are effectively forming a global superorganism, akin to how neurons form a brain. SPMC 1 VUB AC B SPMC 1 VUB ACB. They point out that individual humans now act somewhat like neurons, exchanging information rapidly over the internet, creating patterns at the global level that no individual orchestrates. For instance, Google search queries can predict flu outbreaks faster than health agencies by aggregating millions of people's symptom searches. It's an emergent phenomenon, not a planned one. Writers like Francis Halion define the global brain as the distributed intelligence emerging from all human and technological agents. VUB ACB, that's a careful phrasing. Distributed intelligence emerging from interaction. It doesn't claim a mystical consciousness. Some go further to speculate about a coming singularity where perhaps human minds and AI are so networked that a true collective self-awareness was the collective unconscious real. Jung sometimes spoke of it almost metaphysically, as if the archetypes existed in a platonic realm of psyche that we all tap into. He even dabbled in ideas like synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that implied a kind of connectedness among minds. If one were inclined, one might see something like the Global Consciousness Project, which monitors random number generators for anomalies. That global emotional coherence affects physical systems. Interestingly, that project has reported statistically odd deviations, claiming trillion-to-1 odds against chance skeptics, dispute the methods, and note the file drawer effect, many non-events. But even the existence of such an experiment shows some people consider a literal group consciousness. The safest conclusion is that collective consciousness is mostly a useful metaphor for the alignment of many individual minds. However, as our coordination improves, we are at least simulating a collective brain more and more. We should also consider the philosophical angle. If you define consciousness as having integrated information, Tononi's integrated information theory, for example, says a system that integrates information beyond certain complexity, then a sufficiently complex network like the internet might eventually hit that threshold. As of now, there's no evidence the internet is self-aware. We'd probably notice Wikipedia started editing itself. But it's a provocative thought. What if one day the aggregation of all our data and AI that analyzes it effectively becomes a higher level intelligence? That's essentially the plot of some sci-fi stories for our practical purposes. Crowdsourcing wisdom. We don't need a spooky group mind. We just need effective collaboration. It's more about process than metaphysics. The crowd can act wise if structured well, that we've shown. And it can act dumb if structured poorly. No magic, just human behavior scaled up. There's also a human tendency to ascribe a mind to any entity that behaves with complexity. For example, we talk about the market reacting, or the spirit of the mob, or even how an ant colony behaves like a single organism with a will in ants. Individually, they're pretty simple, but as a colony, they do things like farm fungi, wage war, raise children, activities we associate with intelligent agents. It emerges from simple interactions, pheromone trail, almost certainly not in the sense we are, but it is a higher level entity that can be studied on its own terms, colony behavior. Similarly, humanity linked by culture and now by instantaneous communication might be seen as a superorganism of sorts. It processes information, e.g. But does it know it's doing that? Does it have an I? That's doubtful. It might remain a metaphor unless some radical shift happens, like neural linking brains or AI achieving global unified intelligence. However, even as metaphor, it's powerful when people act as part of something larger than themselves. That's a psychological state, sometimes called de-individuation, or a flow state in a team. It's real to them, but it doesn't prove an actual merge of consciousness. Perhaps the metaphor is enough. It allows us to discuss collective behavior in a meaningful way. Talk of a hive mind or group soul can be a colorful way to capture how a group can have attributes none of its members have alone. For instance, no single person wanted or intended a financial crisis, but the market's collective consciousness, driven by fear and greed, created one. As if an invisible hand or mind panicked, we say the market panicked. That's a shorthand for millions of individuals making sell decisions that aggregate to a crash. So is that phenomenon real? The outcomes are real, the crash. It's distributed causality. You can see how slippery it gets in language. At this point, let's gather what we've learned and return to our original question, phrased simply: can we crowdsource wisdom? The journey through Jung and modern tech suggests we can crowdsource knowledge and judgments under the right conditions. Wikipedia is proof of crowdsourced knowledge prediction market. Show crowds can foresee events. Crowds can solve certain problems and innovate in certain frameworks, open source. Without guidance, crowds can become mobs, irrational, short-sighted, with good design incentives, diversity, independence, feedback. Crowds can be very wise indeed. Jung's collective unconscious gives a poetic backdrop, reminding us that humans have common tendencies. They require effort and communication, not just tapping an unconscious well. Collective consciousness, in the literal sense. We haven't detected a global mind that knows itself, but as a metaphor, it helps describe the very tangible rise of global collective behaviors and decision systems. In essence, crowdsourcing wisdom is possible to a surprising degree, but it is not guaranteed. and it's not a panacea. It turns out, wisdom still demands certain virtues, even from a crowd open-mindedness. A crowd that embodies those can achieve remarkable things. A crowd lacking them can fall into folly worse than any lone fool, because it has the power of numbers behind it. Conclusion: the tapestry of minds and the path to collective wisdom. So, can we crowdsource wisdom? Our exploration suggests a cautiously optimistic yes. Yes, when we set up the conditions well, the many can indeed be wiser than the few. We've seen glimpses of that in communities that aggregate knowledge, like Wikipedia. In markets and forums, where predictions and solutions emerge from the crowd, and in new experiments that give groups direct power over decisions, DAOs. We've also seen the flip side: crowds can go astray, amplifying error or emotion, whether in an internet witch hunt or a stock market bubble or a political echo chamber. Carl Jung gave us an evocative image of a collective psyche, rich with archetypal wisdom, but also dark undercurrents. Within our collective discourse, we often replay those archetypal dramas, heroes and villains of the day, myths of progress or decline, tribal US versus them instincts. The internet, as some have argued, has made the once hidden collective unconscious visible in the form of trending memes. It's as though the internet is a giant mirror, reflecting humanity's psyche back to itself. In real time, whether that makes us wiser is still up for debate. Awareness is the first step to wisdom, and the internet certainly has made us more aware of each other's thoughts for better and worse. But wisdom also requires reflection and integration. Not just information. We traced how collective intelligence can be harnessed. From Aristotle's notion that a potluck of contribution beats a single chef's meal, to Galton's ox, where averaging eliminated individual error, to the smart group research showing social sensitivity and turn-taking trump individual IQ in group success. It values diverse input. It allows independent thought. It aggregates those thoughts fairly. And it has feedback loops to correct mistakes. In other words, when we crowdsourced this essay in spirit, by drawing on many sources and voices, we treated those sources as nodes. By knitting them together, we aim to produce a narrative richer than any single source could provide. That is essentially what collective wisdom is. Synergy. The whole becomes more insightful than the part. However, it's important to acknowledge that wisdom is not just about correct answers or efficient decisions. It has a moral and philosophical dimension. Wisdom often implies a long-term perspective, compassion, ethical judgment, the ability to navigate human values. Can those be crowdsourced? That's tricky. A crowd might maximize for what's popular or expedient, which isn't always what's wise in the higher sense. For instance, a crowdsourced verdict might punish a scapegoat unjustly because public opinion demands blood. A wise judge might resist that. A crowdsourced policy might ignore minority rights if the majority has a bias. Some deliberative democracy experiments, citizen assemblies, have shown promise here. When average citizens are given time, diverse and a respectful environment, they can come to nuanced, compassionate decisions about complex issues like healthcare or constitutional change. That suggests that if we design the crowd process to encourage empathy and thoughtfulness, our individual reasoning is always influenced by others, by culture, by conversation. We are already, in a sense, products of collective thought language itself. Crowdsourcing wisdom means structuring our collective interactions in ways that amplify insight rather than noise it, means leveraging our connective technologies from the printing press to the internet to whatever comes next to pull knowledge without drowning out individual creativity and conscience. Jung's collective unconscious was a given. You can't really opt out of it. But our modern collective intelligence platforms are choices, tools we build and refine. We can choose to make Reddit a place of constructive exchange or a hive of trolling. The phenomenon of collective consciousness may be more metaphor than literal, but as a metaphor, it reminds us, whether as a mob or as a collaborative brain trust, we create something bigger than ourselves. We should strive to make that something bigger enlightened. Ultimately, the crowd is us. If we seek wisdom from it, we're really seeking wisdom from the distributed pieces of ourselves in others. It calls for humility. No one of us knows it all, and for trust balanced with skepticism, the group can be wrong. It's about engaging responsibly as part of that hive, each of us contributing our best beeswax. To the comb, perhaps the answer. To can we crowdsource wisdom? Is only if we crowdsource wisely. Wisdom is both the goal and required ingredient. The crowd will reflect what we put into it. If we input ignorance, anger, or prejudice en masse, that's what we'll get back. Magnified if we input knowledge, critical thinking. The results can be illuminating. The collective mind, to the extent it exists, is a mirror of our collective character in the future. We might develop new methods to literally pool our thoughts, brain-computer interfaces, AI that integrates human input, but it will only be as wise as the humans who constitute it, or the values we imbue in our AI collaborator. Therefore, cultivating individual wisdom and critical thinking remains crucial even in an age of collective intelligence. We set out with Jung in mind and end with perhaps a Jungian-flavored thought. Jung believed individuation, personal growth, and self-awareness. In modern terms, each of us becoming more informed, more empathetic, and more thoughtful makes the collective mind healthier. So yes, we can crowdsource wisdom, but each of us carries a responsibility for the piece of wisdom or folly we contribute to the potluck. In closing, imagine humanity's knowledge and insight as a great big jigsaw puzzle. No single person has all the pieces. Crowdsourcing is our way of bringing pieces together. That is our crowdsourced wisdom. It's real, and it's greater than any solitary mind's picture. Yet, it's only as clear as the collective effort is honest and cooperative, as we continue to weave our individual threads into the grand tapestry of the collective mind. The hope is that we weave a fabric strong and rich enough to support the weight of the world's challenges, a fabric of shared wisdom, in which we can all trust wisdom may not literally reside in a crowd, the way water resides in a jug. Through coordination, harmony, and a guiding structure in the grand symphony of human collective intelligence. And the music we make together can either be cacophonous or sublime. The score is still being written, and we are both composers and performers. The potential for a beautiful, wise harmony is there if we choose to listen to one another and to think together deep. In that sense, crowdsourcing wisdom is not just possible, it may be essential for navigating the complexity of our interconnected world. The crowd can be wise when we, the crowd's members, bring our wisdom to the table and keep our minds open in the shared pursuit of understanding. That is the art of crowdsourced wisdom, the realization that we think better together when we honor both the many voices and the common ground between them. And perhaps, just perhaps, that collective endeavor is as close as we'll get to a true collective consciousness.